Hello, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is focused on going through with you the different types of yarn and their structure, specifically to help you understand why chenille yarn is different and the fact that you do have to work with it slightly differently in order to get the best from your yarn and in order not to drive yourself crazy with frustration. Chenille yarn's not difficult to work with, but you do need to work with it slightly differently. So we're going through reds today. Hopefully you'll be able to see this okay on camera. So the three different types of yarn that I've got here for you is I've got a cotton yarn from Paintbox. I've then got an acrylic yarn, which is also from Paintbox. And then I'm demonstrating today with a chenille yarn from Premier Yarns, which is an American, or it ships from America. I believe the yarn is made in Turkey. Yeah, made in Turkey, like most of the other yarns. So this is going to be the chenille yarn that we're going to work with. So let's just have a little look. Let's go and have a look at the cotton yarn first of all. So cotton yarn obviously is made from cotton. It's really, really great if you're making things for children because cotton obviously has, wonderful breathability. And it's quite a soft yarn, but it's firm in its structure. What I mean is that it's not like the yarn isn't squishy, but it is soft as you would imagine cotton to be. So cotton yarn comes in like a strand, but it's basically a strand comprised of lots of smaller strands all twisted together. So if I zoom in here and show you what I mean, I can twist this and you'll start to see all of this separation of the individual strands. So several strands make up one string of the yarn. And it looks like this, so it's twisted, almost like a rope. So cotton yarn isn't overly expensive, so it is quite an economical sort of yarn for you to use when you're trying. You will need to size down with the recommended hook sizes. So this yarn, as an example, recommends a 4.5mm hook. I would be inclined to use something much smaller than that. So if I just show you the hook that I would ordinarily use. So specifically for amigurumi, which is what my videos are focused on, you want to downsize your hook quite some way in order to make sure that you have really nice tight stitches that that you can't poke through, you can't see stuffing through. So for cotton yarn, although the recommended hook size is 4.5, I actually use a 2.5 hook. If I just show you that. So that's a 2.5 hook. Shout out to What the Hook Creations who made this hook for me. It's absolutely beautiful and I love working with it. A 2.5 hook, as you can see here, is really skinny, so I do recommend you get a hook that has a handle or you purchase something that you can attach to your hook. It's too narrow to work with long term. Now, when I started, I used cotton yarn for everything. I made rattles with it. I made amigurumis with it. I found that the thinness of the yarn and the small size of the hook that I had to use in order to get the tight stitches just really hurt my fingers. Like they would burn after a good few hours of crochet with my fingertips. So I kind of came away from cotton yarn. You can use a normal size hook, like a 4.5 hook potentially, if you're making garments with cotton yarn. Cotton yarn's really, really popular for making like summer festival tops and things like that. But that's the structure of cotton yarn. It's quite easy to work with. The only difficulty that you may get is you may find that your hook, when you're crocheting, it can occasionally split the fibers, and again this can be quite a nuisance because it then destroys the look of the yarn. So if you catch a piece like this and you pull it through, which does happen, you end up with this little snag on your rope. So you do have to be careful. It's quite hard once you've got a snag to get it to work back in, especially when you're partway through a project, it is quite difficult. You can see that it just doesn't look, if I put my fingers in front of that, you can see that it just doesn't look great once the yarn has been split. So that's cotton yarn. There isn't any real secret to working with it, but specifically for amigurumi, you want to drop down to a 2.5 or a 3 hook is my recommendation, and be careful that you don't split the yarn. So the next yarn that we're going to talk about is acrylic yarn. Most people will be familiar with this yarn. It's what most people start out working with, because you get quite large balls of wool. And it's very inexpensive, and acrylic yarn has fantastic colour ranges, as does cotton yarn, in fairness. So again, this is what the rope, the strand, looks like, single. But again, it's a single strand that's comprised of, in this example, 3 smaller strands that again have been twisted. So if I untwist that, you can start to see they've been twisted together to make the one strand. So again, very similar to working with the cotton yarn. It's very straightforward. I would again be downsizing my hook size. So the recommendation for this yarn is 5mm. I'm probably using 3.5 to 4mm working with this type of yarn, specifically for amigurumi. So one of the things that can happen, much the same as the cotton yarn, is you can split the yarn, which is quite frustrating. And again, if you catch it as you're pulling your hook out, you can cause that yarn to fully come out of sync with the other strands, which can affect the finish of your product. You'll see here that acrylic yarn is quite fluffy. If you can just see that here, you can see that there's lots of fibres coming off of the main strand. That also can make your acrylic projects look a bit tired, like they're a bit worn, and they're not. They're fresh off the hook. The more you work this yarn, the more you overwork this yarn, the worse those fibres that you see coming off will be. Again, acrylic yarn can be quite soft. I don't find it rough or itchy in the same way that I would pure wool. Fantastic colour ranges, as I mentioned before. But again, you can do very detailed, very complex projects in cotton and acrylic yarn, get lots of detail, and it's fantastic where you're making these really ornate and intricate sort of collectible pieces. It's very difficult to do that in plush yarn without it being absolutely mega size. So acrylic yarn is really great for that. And I always recommend people start with acrylic yarn because it's inexpensive. If something goes wrong, it's not the end of the world. It's maybe cost you £2 a ball of yarn. And then the last one to talk to you about, and the most important one from my perspective, is chenille yarn. So chenille yarn is constructed very, very differently. You can see it's still one strand here, just one strand of yarn, but the composition is quite different. So here is my end of the tail, and I've just pulled some of this off, and this is what we call shed, by the way, and you'll hear me refer to that throughout my YouTube videos. So chenille yarn is comprised of, more often than not, a couple of strings that are entwined together. So we've got 4 strings here that are split evenly into 2 strands. And what happens is the fibre is wrapped really, the string, sorry, is twisted really, really tightly with the fibre materials in between the 2 twisted strands. So when you cut the end off of your yarn, those strands start to unravel, which is where you get your shed from. And it will only generally shed to a certain point. So here I'm pulling very lightly and there's no more shed coming off. But that is the construction of chenille yarn. The fluffy material is twisted between 2 strands. And because of this composition, chenille yarn can be quite tricky to work with. So what happens with the more you work chenille yarn, and I'm just going to demonstrate this for you. So the more friction you create, so I'm just rubbing gently backwards and forwards. So I'm just working this backwards and forwards. Premier Parfait Chunky is quite a good brand of yarn, so it takes a lot for yarn to split. But what you can see here is the fibres have started to separate, and you can see the strings that are holding the fibres together. You can see them come through, and you can see you get this sort of gappy, what I call split yarn. The string is no longer one continuous piece of plush. We've now got this split, this separation. So this can happen with chenille yarn, and it happens when it's overworked. It happens when you're working with it too tight, and it also happens because not all brands of chenille yarn are made equally. Some are much better than others. So there are some hints and tips and some tricks to working with chenille yarn in order to avoid this. So the most common problem areas will be when you're doing your magic ring and pulling your magic ring tight. As you can imagine, if I was to now try to tie a knot where I've got this splitting, it doesn't want to tie properly because it's got caught between two bits of split yarn. If I pull really tight, I can kind of make it work. And that's the same with the magic ring. If you're working your magic ring too tight, you'll find that when you come to pull tight your magic ring and close it, that it will often split, and it will make the pulling of the magic ring impossible, and you'll often pull to the point that you'll snap your yarn. So with regards to working in the magic ring, we recommend either going up a hook size to what you're going to be working with, or half a hook size, or just do your magic ring with a slightly looser tension, and don't pull the magic ring so taut and so tight. So if I just go back to showing you in the acrylic yarn, so here's my magic ring. There we go, just don't want to split that yarn. So what you would do here once you've done this is you would tighten that up, and you'd pull that quite tight. You want to, so that's a really tight knot now, and then you would proceed with your magic ring. And that's quite a tight knot. You want to avoid doing that with chenille yarn. So if we go back to the chenille, and I show you here my magic ring. When I get to this point here, I'm going to ever so slightly, just so it's a tiny bit tighter, but I've kept it quite loose. And then I'm going to loosely, with a nice light tension, crochet however many I need in my magic ring. Do one more. So I've kept that bottom knot not too tight, and then when I come to pull my magic ring to tighten it, I tend to hold towards the bottom. So keep it held towards the bottom, and then I'll pull. And once you've got your yarn through that bottom stitch, it very seldom sticks after that. And then I've got my magic ring. If I go on to complete the first stitch of the first row, you can see here that I've got a nice magic ring, and I've got a lovely tail that I can use to tighten that up, because I have done it with slightly looser tension. So that is a little tip, a little trick to doing your magic ring, because that's a big problem point with chenille yarn. The other thing with chenille yarn is frogging. You've realised you've made a mistake. The earlier you notice your mistake with chenille yarn, the better. You will struggle to frog several rows and not have some splitting. Frogging is possible, but you must work slowly. You can't frog at the speed that you would an acrylic yarn. With chenille yarn, you need to crochet slowly, one little stitch at a time. If you find that you've got a bit of resistance, go in there with your finger and just try and pick it a little bit, and then pull again. So frogging can be done probably only once. If you're very lucky, you can get it done twice, but the earlier you realise your mistake, the better. So another area where chenille yarn can be slightly problematic is when you are sewing pieces together. Now, for most amigurumi projects, especially larger ones, there is an element of sewing pieces together. So I've just made a couple of circles. They're not exactly the same. I've literally just stitched until it felt right. And I'm using a plastic darning needle. So my first recommendation is to use a plastic darning needle over a metal one. If you have a plastic darning needle that has a angled nib, like this is metal, but it's got an angle at the top, I think those are better than a straight plastic needle. But for demonstration purposes, this will do. So first tip is use a plastic needle. Second tip is when sewing pieces together, you need to go in the direction that you are sewing in. With the grain is how I describe it, which isn't going to be helpful until I show you. So here I've got a piece which I've crocheted together. So I'm going to go under this loop, and I'm going to go under these loops on the second piece. And what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to minimize the amount of friction that I'm creating. So as this yarn pulls through these hoops, if I zoom in, there is friction. The yarn is pulling against other yarn. And when I say go with the grain, I mean I continue to pull straight out and away from me, because that's the trajectory of the route that I'm taking. What I don't want to be doing, if I just do this as a whip stitch going over, what I don't want to be doing is I don't want to be pulling through and then pulling back towards me, because I'm creating additional friction of the yarn rubbing back over this piece of yarn. And you will find very quickly, if you do that, that you will start to get that splitting, and you'll also get increased shedding at your tail. So go with the grain. I know that's such a bad turn of phrase for this purposes, but that's the one that I use, so that's the one that I'm sticking with. And so again, I'm just going to go under the next band of stitches, and I'm going to pull and continue in the direction that I was sewing in. And that is another tip that will help to minimize splitting and increased shedding. The final tip that I recommend is to, where it says leave a long tail for a project for sewing, I recommend you leave an even longer tail. And I recommend that when you are sewing your pieces together, you keep your tail yarn, this bit here that goes through the hoop, short. Because what you will find is where your needle is where the most tension's going to be. So you will find that this, you can see it's already started to happen. If I zoom in here, you can see that we've got this divot here where my needle has been. So that is going to be the place that you're more than likely going to get your splitting to occur first, because obviously this dragging through the yarn is creating tension. So the longer the tail you leave, when this bit gets a bit raggedy, you can just move along, chop off the old tail, give yourself another new little tail, but you've moved on to a good piece of plush yarn. So you get to creep your way up through the tail rather than having to cut a new piece and start again. So recommend that you keep a longer tail and you crochet with as little actual tail through the hoop as possible, giving you more room to climb your hook as you go. So thank you very much for joining us on this short YouTube tutorial, basically explaining the differences between the main types of yarn that you might decide to work with on your crochet amigurumi journey. Most of the things that you've seen us use in the video, so the hook, the needles, etc., those are also available on our website, which is in the description below. Until the next time.